Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Cheers, Kevin. Well, welcome everyone. And as Kevin said, we meet every Saturday, the Organic Intellectuals, and we've been meeting since the start of the pandemic. Really, I think our first meeting was back last April, and it's been essentially a weekly talking shop to kind of keep us in touch with our cooperative principles, to keep that kind of social space going that we've all been missing, and particularly during the winter time, which was quite bleak. But we've had this kind of, I suppose, this salon really of ideas, a kind of an intellectual hothouse where we've been discussing a lot of the big issues that have been not just facing Dublin and Dublin Food Co-op, but kind of that are really kind of internationally important as well. And I think that's why an event like this today is really got to like tie together a lot of the kind of threads of discussion that we've been having on a weekly basis. And for those of you who aren't a member of the Dublin Food Co-op, I'll just give you a quick sort of, Kevin's kind of very nicely outlined what we do with the community development programme, but just to say that Dublin Food Co-op has basically been in the heart of Dublin since 1983 and is a food democracy that promotes ethically sourced organic food. And all members are owners and have a say over the running of the co-op itself. And a quick reminder to all the members are here, our AGM is on the 23rd of June. So let's go and flex those democratic muscles over Zoom. So let me bring you to today's guest. So we've been discussing many big ideas, many of them touching upon, which is kind of unavoidable really, is the question of environmental breakdown. And Mathew Lawrence, who's a friend of mine from the days back in London, formerly of IPPR, is now director of the Commonwealth think tank, which is a think tank that promotes ownership for a democratic and sustainable economy. He's the author of, well, many fine policy reports, but including COVID-19 and the 21st century public ownership, as well as the Digital Commonwealth from Private Enclosure to Collective Benefit, which he co-authored with Laurie Laybourn-Langton. And I guess that was maybe, I don't know, Matt, maybe you'll say a little bit more about this, but that I think might have been the springboard into this book, which has just recently been published by Verso, Planet on Fire, a Manifesto for the Age of Environmental Breakdown, also co-authored with Laurie Laybourn-Langton. I just finished reading it this week. It's a fine piece of literature. It's an incredibly well-written book, actually, but it's also filled with ideas, and it's a fantastic, urgent, and very, very necessary intervention into many of the debates that are going on locally, nationally, and internationally. As you know, we're discussing this as a G7 meeting in Cornwall at the moment, and also later on this year we have the COP26, is it? Well, one of the COPs anyway, at Glasgow. So I guess just another point of housekeeping, I suppose, Matt, before I let you take over the floor. People feel free to write questions as they occur to you in the chat, and I'll try and you know, make sure we get to all those points. Or if you can raise your hand, or maybe if we have to, or maybe give a reaction. Basically, just let me know that you want to ask a question, and I'll make sure I get round to you. So Matt, if you'd like to maybe summarize and tell us about the book.
Sure. Thanks, Patrick. Great to see you again. Great to be with you all this morning. So I'm Mathew Lawrence, as mentioned. I'm the director of Commonwealth, which is a UK-based think tank. And as the sort of name suggests, it's very much focused on issues of commoning, of common ownership, of sort of new models of ownership and democratizing economic power. So it's a pleasure to be with all the cooperators this morning. I thought what I'd quickly do is sketch sort of a little bit of how the book emerged, which Patrick sort of touched upon, a couple of the sort of the key sort of stories and themes that we tell in the book, and then some of the sort of overarching sort of solutions bucket, so to speak, which can then hopefully tee up a conversation around question of direction, question of political strategy, etc., etc. So the first thing, as mentioned, I used to work at IPPR, which is a UK-based think tank. It's sort of broadly sort of centre-left, social democratic. And Laurie and I would do a series of reports, and we'd often sort of speak, and this was around 2018, let's say, often speak to mainstream politicians, journalists, civil servants, in which there was an awareness of the climate crisis as something that was like, oh yeah, we need to take this seriously, but not really about the sort of the scale and the fact that it was already happening now for hundreds of millions of people, but that the compounding scale of it would be deeply traumatic, and that the sort of trajectories that we're still on towards a world of 3.5, 4 degree temperature rises would be catastrophic for human life as we know. But not only was it the climate crisis that was sort of underplayed, there were two other factors. There was the fact that there was actually a broad array of environmental sort of factors that are breaking down, as we discuss in the book. So whether that's soil erosion very rapidly, which is leading to sort of, and you can see it in the news actually at the moment, like spiking of food prices, food insecurity. Obviously, you guys will know this much better than me, but sort of, the politics of food, whether it's about water tables, whether it's about collapsing biodiversity, whether it's sort of, desalination. There's a whole series of environmental factors which really, if we're a bit better on the climate crisis, and in the last few years, it's been really exciting to see sort of the school strikers, the sort of Green New Deal movements, and sort of a lot of the energy there. But really that hasn't translated into many other sort of interrelated factors of environmental breakdown. So that was one of the first things, the drivers of the book, this like the sort of scale of these interlocking, compounding forces driving environmental breakdown. And then that second point of we've got this sort of multi-nature crisis, and it's not sort of episodic or related to a few bad apples, sort of just because Exxon's a bad sort of company or whatever it might be. It's because of a sort of systemic design at its root, a series of institutions, the for-profit corporation, sort of an economy organized around sort of maximizing profit rather than need, around the sort of power of finance, around sort of ability to organize nature and labor in very hierarchical and extractive terms through sort of property, through sort of capital. That is driving this. So we really wanted to stress a systemic crisis requires a systemic response, which I'll go into where we think that might be. And then to sort of, touch on this and bring it together. So we open, or sort of one of the sort of opening chapters in the book touched on the sort of story of Easter Island. So Easter Island was used by Jared Diamond, sort of popular historians of airport, sort of book historian type person, in his book Collapse. And it's sort of, I guess, sort of more widely known as well as this sort of emblematic example of how humans are sort of psychologically incapable of dealing with restraint, dealing with the sort of politics of ecological limits, etc., etc. So the story essentially goes, well, this island in Easter Island, sort of the Dutch sailors arrived there in the sort of 17th and 18th century and found this island, which was decimated, which were these strange sort of stone monoliths, and this sort of civilization that seemed to have like basically collapsed very quickly. And the sort of implication was, well, what happened was, even though they knew if they chopped down this last tree, that would trigger sort of environmental collapse, nonetheless, the sort of people of Easter Island sort of couldn't help it. They couldn't help ecocide. And then that sort of story was taken as a sort of microcosm of Easter Island, as a microcosm of humanity's inability to deal with ecological constraint, our sort of drive, our psychological drive almost towards consumption, towards the sort of degradation of our sort of social and environmental world in a way that leads to collapse, which is a very powerful and very problematic story in many ways. But of course, the big point about it in the book is that this story is wrong. So what we then trace instead is actually how a whole series of new, really interesting research over the last 10, 15 years has uncovered quite a different story of the sort of trauma of Easter Island, and then quite a different sort of trajectory of what that means in terms of how we deal with environmental crisis, its drivers, its origins, and where we go. So the alternative and much more accurate portrayal is actually when European sort of sailors, who were sort of essentially sort of intermediaries for colonization, arrived sort of looking for a watering spot, what they found is a society that actually was essentially had managed to live in a steady state. So they had migrated from old food systems that had been sort of land-based towards sustainable forms of fishing. They had essentially, it was a thriving culture. Health was fairly strong. It was actually sort of very much a sort of successful sort of steady state economy. And of course, what drove Easter Island's collapse was actually the violence of colonialism, the violence of extraction, the violence of sort of being incorporated into global markets and sort of circuits of accumulation and trade on very unequal terms. So, they brought slavery, they brought sort of sexually transmitted diseases, they sort of absolutely ravaged the environment, they sort of ransacked its resources, and it was actually the imposition of these forces of, sort of the prototypes of capitalism, the prototypes of sort of global imperialism in the sort of 17th century onwards, that actually was what drove collapse. And so there is a sort of story of Easter Island as a sort of miniature sort of Earth, but it's not that humanity is sort of doomed to be ecocidal. It's that actually these dynamics of enclosure, extraction, and expansion, which are central to sort of dynamics of capitalism and sort of imperial capitalism, are what drove that and are what is driving environmental breakdown in the round. So that kind of tees up the sort of like analytic, that's a sort of brief sweep of the sort of teeing up of the sort of problem and sort of its roots. So what we argue is that in the face of these sort of drives of extraction, expansion, enclosure, rinse and repeat, which is sort of really the root of many sort of economic challenges, from inequality to sort of stagnation through to environmental collapse. What we argue for then is sort of, and I'll sort of touch on these and then open up the conversation perhaps, but what we argue then is sort of a sort of set of interlocking institutional turns, sort of deep reimaginings of how we would organize our economy in a sort of series of spheres. So we first touch on, international solidarity and ways of reorganizing a global economy, whose architecture currently, whether it's the World Bank, the G7, Patrick mentioned, the IMF, sort of international financial architecture, which we've seen very much during COVID-19, when sort of the global north have been very much able to borrow at will, which is a good thing, but the terms in which the global south can borrow very much hierarchical in the favor of wealthier nations. So we look at this overarching international architecture of cooperation, coordination, and say we need new institutions of solidarity. So we sort of set out plans for new sort of regulation of international financial flows, reform of things like the World Bank, the IMF, to make sure the voices of those who are at the sharp end of these policies actually structure and corporatize these institutions in terms of democratic voice. We then look at sort of finance. So finance is this sort of expansive force that can kind of bring the future to life. So if finance directs investment towards fossil fuels, they will come to life. If they direct investments towards renewable energy, that's a very different future. So we look at some of the underlying sort of dynamics linked to these for-profit corporations that can create and direct credit as a sort of this extraordinary financial privilege, and instead argue that what we really need is sort of a new architecture where sort of finance is brought back under democratic control. So whether that's the expansion of public investment to drive and sustain decarbonization at a rapid and equitable pace, whether it's about the use of central banking to sort of backstop and direct the economy towards sustainability, whether that's about sort of challenging the prerogative and power of private finance. There's a whole set of things we really need to do, because at the moment, sort of the financial system is a locomotive force of inequality and breakdown, but it can be, with reform, a key ally of transformation. We then look at work, the politics of work, where we argue there should be a sort of double sort of movement, really. So work currently is organized in ways that disempower labor, in ways that sort of are hierarchical, patterns of domination, exclusion, organized in deeply unequal and unfair ways. We argue that sort of a new agenda around decommodification, around democratization, can really begin to sort of reshape and lessen how much we work. So it's a future of better work, but also less work. So that, whether that's rolling out collective bargaining and the democratization of workplaces, whether that's about sort of the provision of welfare systems and sort of publicly owned services that enable people to live well outside of market relations, and so therefore can choose to work rather than being forced to work. There's a whole set of things we can do to begin to lessen to some of the sort of structural inequalities that sort of structure work and the workplace, and therefore the dynamics of power that sort of filter through and lead to the inequalities that sort of scar all our societies. We then look at two more, which I suppose are of potentially particular interest to the Co-op members. So the first is looking at sort of ownership, and they're obviously interrelated, but looking at ownership. So here we sort of look at how the corporation as a sort of legal and political institution has been sort of captured by a combination of shareholder and managerial power, and that has sort of redirected this sort of institution towards the production of inequality rather than the production of the meeting of human and environmental needs. And so we look at how we can transform that. But then we also look at it's not enough to sort of democratize the corporation. We actually need to rapidly scale a whole set of place-based forms of democratic enterprise. So whether that's cooperatives, community business, sort of social enterprise, new forms of municipal enterprise. And really here we sort of say that at the moment, those institutions are operating in a sort of hostile economic environment. So the legal infrastructure, the sort of financial infrastructure, the sort of regulatory architecture, these are all designed and set up to support and boost the for-profit corporation as a sort of key institution in our economy. So if we're serious about sort of transforming this sort of generative landscape of enterprise, we need to reset and actively support institutions like cooperatives rather than just expecting them to sort of succeed on their own and on their goodwill of their members. And then sort of after looking at sort of reimagining ownership, we look at a sort of related thing, which is the commons. So how can we not just democratize ownership, but actually sort of transform certain assets and resources away from being owned in the first place and towards being stewarded as part of a sort of commons of shared resources. And so here we look at a sort of whole host of things. So one of them is food systems, which says another reason why it's great to be with you all today, but looking at how agribusiness and agro-capitalist models of food production and distribution are failing to provide food security and decent work for the vast majority of the population of the global south. And then sort of look at how existing food systems in the global north, which obviously connected to those unequal systems in the south, are generating huge amounts of environmental costs at the back end, whether that's emissions, deforestation, there's a whole host of things. So we look at sort of some of the reforms that the food system could be sort of done to change that. And then in the other areas, we look at commoning, we look at data and technology. So we sort of look at a quite expansive sense of commoning. We look at data and technology to say, look, data is a sort of social product. It emerges through our sociality. That should not be controlled by these big platforms, these digital monopolies, but actually should be something that is pooled and shared and used as a sort of common resource. And then we also look at digital technology, so things like broadband infrastructure, some of the sort of technologies that we all, cloud computing. These are things that we all rely upon and are fundamental to how we operate. The pandemic has really shown how access to good internet is critical to being able to sort of live as a sort of flourishing sort of individual and in a community during the pandemic. So if we say like these things should be organized by need as sort of commons-based management rather than by the control of very financialized private corporations. And then we sort of look at a sort of series of other, I guess, more classic commoning areas. So we look at land and how we can common land, new models of land stewardship, both to address environmental breakdown, but also to sort of scale up new neighborhoods of high quality, low cost housing, public, cooperative, the whole sort of host of models that are much better than the extractive financialized models we've got. And then looking at finally some of the sort of natural resources in the round. So whether it's the Amazon, whether it's fossil fuel assets, we really need to sort of transition how they're used from a model based on private ownership for profit towards the sort of commoning and the shared stewardship of these resources in ways that sort of align much more effectively human well-being and flourishing with sustainable management of those resources. That's kind of a very broad brush whiz through the agenda, but very much in line with sort of the cooperative movement's agendas around sort of democratization of economic enterprise, around sort of forms of cooperation within and between enterprise, around sort of centering of meeting of needs over sort of profit maximization of democratic organization of production, not just sort of capital's oligarchic rule. So the whole sort of set of things there. And then finally we end, but I'll probably sort of just note that rather than go into it, but we end with sort of, okay, fine, that's an agenda, whether it's good or not, I'll leave for you all to decide, but that's an agenda. But actually the problem right now in some ways is not having ideas, it's how do you sort of mobilize the sort of political and social power to enact those ideas. And that's really the sort of challenge, I guess, facing the left, progressives, movements seeking change in the context of crisis. How can we cohere and mobilize the sort of social and political forces to leverage change, whether that's on the granular or at the systemic, and really you want to work the two in tandem. So I'll leave that sort of question as something we can touch into, sort of the politics and the political coalition building, but that's a broad overview of Planet on Fire.
Thanks very much, Matt. That was really interesting, and the book covers a huge amount of ground, so it's really amazing you're able to kind of be that succinct and raise so many different issues. And I'm sure there's got to be lots of questions coming in now, but I'm going to just abuse my prerogative as the chair to ask. Well, I'm really interested about that question about politics. Maybe that we'll come back to that. But just at a more practical level, this book came out this year. I'm assuming it was gestating for a little while, and obviously in the middle of that we had the pandemic. And I just wondered if you could say something about maybe how COVID-19 and the kind of the global shift that's happened, or whether that's a short-term or long-term shift, I guess we'll wait to see. How did that impact the writing of the book and the types of ideas you're engaging with, or were you kind of, I mean, were the arguments kind of still kind of, you know, were they still generating the same kind of ideas really?
Yeah, I mean, it's I guess events always intervene, don't they? But it was quite an interesting, you know, gestation that sort of began, I guess, in the autumn of 2019. And then in the UK, at least December 2019, the general election here was obviously, you know, a sort of a setback for ambitious action on climate, let's say. So that kind of had, you know, had to be a bit of a sort of like, okay, well, how do you sort of map onto that? And then the Sanders campaign in the US, you know, sort of was tweeted in February. So it's like, okay, there's another little like bit of reorganizing, but obviously sort of the biggest part was obviously, you know, sort of COVID, and which we sort of began. We sort of, I think we had it in the manuscript in June. So I think, well, it's sort of all finished or all edited. So I think it's definitely there in the book, and so that obviously forced a refit. In some ways, it sort of aligns very much with the arguments, though. So one, in terms of like, you know, its deep-rooted cause in some ways is the entanglement of natural systems, food systems, you know, deforestation, etc., into circuits of accumulation, into sort of, you know, sort of marketized relationships, and that, you know, sort of brought, you know, deforestation, you know, migration of biodiversity, wet markets, etc., and then obviously the way it's spread through global trade. So I think there's an interesting thing there that in some ways, you know, the sort of systemic origins of climate crisis and environmental breakdown are the same, you know, interlinked causes that are behind COVID-19. And even if it's a lab leak or whatever, there's still, you know, I still think that argument broadly holds. So I think there's a sort of, that was an interesting thing that we use in the book. I think there's, you know, another thing we sort of touched on in the book in relation to COVID is, I can't remember, I don't know if people remember, but like early on in the crisis, there was this like meme going around of like, you know, Venice was empty and like, you know, waterways were becoming clearer, and, you know, various like sort of cities and human locations were sort of empty of human sort of inhabitants, or at least they're all behind doors. Nature was returning, and there's this sort of like slogan, humanity is the disease, COVID is the cure. And we kind of use that as kind of, you know, one, you know, an example of one of the potential avenues which environmental breakdown could mutate in terms of politics, which is kind of this turn to almost like an eco-fascist agenda, in which the argument is, okay, well, yes, rather than saying environmental breakdown is just a complete hoax, which I guess has been the sort of reactionary position for decades, is to say, well, maybe it's happening, sure, but certainly we're not going to sort of, you know, cut the sort of living standards of, you know, Western communities, you know, coded as, you know, white people broadly, to prevent it. And we're certainly not going to let sort of climate refugees and people who are being forced out of their homes by, you know, environmental breakdown to come into Europe. So you can see, if you look at like the language of Marine Le Pen and a whole host of other sort of, you know, sort of far-right politicians in the European Parliament, there's a lot of language around like, you know, lifeboats. If you're on a lifeboat, it's humane to sort of chop the hands off of people trying to climb in. Otherwise, you'll, you know, capsize it. You know, sort of the border is our greatest friend. We believe in ecology. We don't believe in sort of, you know, migration. And the whole sort of set of things, which sort of you can kind of see that meme links to those type of sort of political views, and then that, you know, that could be one trajectory. And then, of course, like, you know, COVID, I think, also showed us this sort of, and it's still showing us sort of, you know, the ability to transfer, you know, a couple of like positive things, like, you know, the ability to respond collectively and rapidly to sort of, you know, big systemic crises, the ability to sort of center, you know, public health and other priorities rather than sort of maximizing shareholder dividends this quarter. So it shows that we can change the system under shocks. But the question, the challenge is in some ways, even though it's boiling rapidly, COVID was very much sort of bang shock, whereas like the climate crisis by nature is like a boiling a frog style shock, and it's a question of like how can we mobilize that energy to be like, right, we need to apply the same urgency and systemic scale that we did to COVID to how we sort of reimagine our economies in its aftermath.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that was one of the jolts I got from reading the book, is how quickly some of those environmental arguments can be transmuted into quite right-wing, even far-right ones. So it's so that it's a worrying development that could be taking place. So we do have a few questions coming in, so I can read them out if people prefer. But Ben, would you like to ask Matt your question there?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Yeah, I mean, it's what I said in the chat. The way you described. I mean, I work for a corporation, and I work for many corporations, so I understand that they're basically a machine to generate profit. And it always kind of surprises me when people are surprised that that's what they do. If you invent a machine that's designed to do that, that's what it's going to do. So the changes you're suggesting are really powerful, but I just feel that there's going to be such strong resistance from those corporations who are designed to do that. I just wonder how you see that change happening in practice.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, we don't underestimate the challenge. So I think there's a couple of things. So one, it's that the corporation as sort of institution is contingent and historically has evolved. So, you can go back to Marx, who was like, wow, the corporation is kind of this strange institution which is sort of socializing property within it, and yet it's controlled by private ownership. But maybe there's an embryonic sort of transformative vehicle in this. You can see that in sort of right through to then sort of the managerial corporation of the 1950s and 60s. People like Galbraith in the US were writing about, the sort of shareholder was passive, it was basically defunct. These corporations are now essentially social institutions. So it's not always been the case that it's just been about maximizing profits for shareholders and sort of wealthy managerial figures. So that's, I think, a sort of a resource of hope potentially, because this is not just like this is just how it is. Of course, the challenge then is, well, what happened? Well, there was a mobilization of political strategy to sort of force the corporation to become much more like it is today, which is sort of disgorging cash to its shareholders, prioritizing what it earns, not to reinvestment, not to boosting wages, not to sort of investing in greening the corporation, but to sort of divesting that to external shareholders. And that was done through legal means, political means, social means. So we need to do the sort of equivalent today. So I think there's to be two things. One, as you say, it's kind of programmed to do that, but it's programmed not by like nature and by immutable law. It's programmed by law and sort of humans control the law ultimately. And actually, like, we do have a sort of legal tools through which we can begin to sort of repurpose the corporation. So this is not some sort of beyond politics institution. How the corporation operates is through politics. So again, that is in some ways a challenge, but it's also sort of a positive, because we know we can reorder this if we've got the legal foundations right. So then that comes to sort of like, how do you mobilize the political power to sort of get those legal leverages working? So I think, I guess there's always sort of two, which we kind of explore in the book, but there's always like two strategies which can either can work together. Sometimes they diverge, but there's either sort of like, okay, we'll go with the incremental like win reforms within the existing system and try and sort of improve it, or sort of have a much more ruptural strategy of like, okay, well, let's go for a big break, let's wait for a sort of moment of crisis and use that to break through. On the first strategy, you can see how, and I think there's limits to this, but you can see how the mobilization of pension funds and other sort of institutional investors that have a sort of natural inclination to, a pension fund has by its nature sort of has got to sort of have a long-term time horizon, mobilizing those to be a voice towards saying, actually, at the very least, you've got to take into account a really serious effort to decarbonize, shift towards institutional sort of sustainability. So that's one channel. Another channel would be the sort of real scaling up and boosting of things like B corporations and alternative models to put pressure on the traditional corporation. Another would be sort of, I guess, mobilizing sort of social power. So whether that's trade unions, whether that's sort of civil society, to say like, actually, this is an institution we can reform, and the reform might lose, there might be a sort of small minority who lose out, like very wealthy shareholders, major institutional investors. But broadly, democratization of the firm will almost certainly lead to better wages, better conditions of work, better sustainability for society in the aggregate. So there's a lot of winners. There's a majoritarian coalition you can construct. But I think part of it is I think the first step to doing that is almost just insisting the corporation is something that I think most people just don't even think about it. It's just oh, that's just how it is. It's just this thing that kind of emerged. They don't really think, well, hold on a second, this was created by us, and therefore we can reform it if we get the politics right. So I think that's the first step. And then there's a sort of set of strategies which either sort of seek incremental reform through institutions that exist, or begin to build sort of social power to sort of change it more systematically down the line.
Yeah, so one of the things that sort of mitigates against those kind of changes, though, is the mobility of corporations. So, and we play that game here big time in Ireland, attracting companies for low tax and so on. And that, so if you have those reforms in, say, the UK, for example, or in France, well, some of those corporations would just move elsewhere to places that are less regulated and labour is cheaper and so on and so on. And okay, eventually we might catch up with them, but it might be too late,
Yes, I mean, I think sort of the ability to enact arbitrage. So Ireland's corporation tax rate is obviously one key sort of link. Netherlands, etc. In the UK obviously has got plenty of tax havens and offshore units too. But those sort of gaps and dog legs in the system are obviously hugely problematic. So we sort of say in the book, there's got to be concerted pressure to sort of in the sort of international section, there's concerted pressure to sort of equalize that. I think there's minimum income tax. I don't know how it's being received amongst the Irish sort of economic sort of policymaking community, but this sort of minimum income tax guarantee or minimum income corporation tax is not perfect, but it's a step forward. Universalizing things like that could be quite interesting. I'm sure there'll be opposition. At the same time, I don't know enough, but if the US does say really put its finger on the weight on the sort of tipping scale and says no, you simply have to do this, I'm not sure whether the Netherlands, Ireland, some of the sort of very low corporation tax entities will really say, well, no, we're still going to do it, given the sort of political power imbalances there. And the other thing I say though is that corporations are sort of definitely hypermobile in some sense, but in the other sense they are very rooted. Like the UK, for example, Brexit, biggest institutional shock in 40, 50 years in the UK. A lot of talk beforehand of well, that's it. Unilever will go to the Netherlands and blah, 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 blah. Everyone will move. And in some ways you say, well, yeah, because why wouldn't you just move to the single market? Why wouldn't you just upshore? But actually, the UK is an example of actually despite the disruption, actually there's a slow bleeding out, absolutely. But it's not right, they're all just going. So they're actually so it's obviously politically in the interest of corporations to say, we're hypermobile, we can up sticks at any point. If you don't do what we do, what we say, we're going to, sort of low tax, low regulation sort of thing. And the third thing would be that's partly exactly because they're sort of codependent on public power. So we've seen during COVID, they are backstopped by central banks, QE on a vast scale, on public sort of spending to sustain the incomes of corporations. There's a circularity, they need sort of wealthy economies to provide these. So I think there are points of leverage, and they are not as sort of beyond the scope of democratic politics as they obviously want to suggest they are. So I think completely take the sort of mobility point. But if that was if it was the case, then you'd see vast amounts of capital moving to Sao Tome or wherever it has so that even the fact that it's moving to Ireland rather than there are much lower tax jurisdictions in Ireland. So there are sort of institutional variations that mean I think we're not in a position where we just need to say, well, we're stuffed, we can't do anything because they can just move. So I think it's a really important challenge, but I think we've got some tools to push back.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have quite a few questions from Kevin. Kevin, do you want to ask your first question, and then I'll take Ailish's, and then...
Yeah. So I keep thinking of more questions as we go. There's just the first question is, can you give some examples? For example, are there countries where you see these models, where you see models for these kind of changes in ownership from corporate for-profit to more equitable and democratic models? Are there some, where do you see examples of this? Are there already existing examples of this?
Yeah, so I think there's examples everywhere, and so I mean, our sense in the book, and the sense in Commonwealth, the organisation I run, and I think you had my colleague or sort of friend Joe Guinan speaking to you recently, and share with all those examples of change is never like a binary, like, okay, well, we've got a corporate and extractive economy here, and then we'll just one day be in a sort of generative and inclusive economy over here. There are institutions that are growing that are sort of prefiguring the type of economy we want to get towards, and the question is, how can you sort of scale those while transforming or repressing the sort of extractive things on this column. So I'd say, like, you could look for anything, and these clearly not enough, but you can look to things like the B Corporation movement I mentioned. You can look to the sort of the cooperative movement globally is sort of extraordinary sort of scale. You can look to things like the community wealth building movement, which is growing across the world. You can look to the re-emergence of municipal and public ownership as an alternative to sort of failed models of privatization. So there's thousands of remunicipalization sort of initiatives going on, and they're sort of popular. Sort of Andy Burnham in the Greater Manchester sort of mayoral election the other day, his big pitch was like, we're going to basically create a publicly owned integrated transport system, and the rest of the UK Labour Party did pretty badly in that election, but sort of Greater Manchester really endorses us. You can kind of see there's a political payoff here as well. It's not just sort of theoretical and abstract sort of commitment to democratizing the economy. And you can also see it in and one example chapter we open with is on Bolsonaro and Brazil. But I think one of the sort of and how he's kind of like emblematic of kind of an eco-fascist sensibility in politics. But I think one of the interesting examples you can look towards is, and of world historic importance with the election next year, but when Lula was president of Brazil and then followed on by Dilma, they had, which actually sort of slightly touched on your commenting question, but they sort of had this approach of, rather than sort of like turning over the Amazon to agribusiness and sort of loggers and ranchers and miners, which obviously completely devastate the landscape and the indigenous communities there, they actually basically sort of turned over management and stewardship of the Amazon in large parts back to indigenous communities and back to sort of like commoning based techniques. And what that saw was a very rapid, basically the first time, like a rapid reforestation of large parts of the Amazon, which is obviously like a critical battle line, fault line in sort of whether we're going to sort of be able to sort of keep temperatures low or not. So that was a model of like world historic environmental and sort of climate sort of importance, and that was like something that emerged during his presidency and then continued by Dilma, and very successful, and rolled back by Bolsonaro, of course. I think it's sort of something like 3 football pitches every 5 seconds at the moment in Brazil are being deforested. So we can, by the end of this call, you can imagine how many that is, or this Zoom. But there really are like lots of examples, from the sort of granular through to those sort of municipal ownership, through to things on the sort of Amazonian scale, that are successful. And I guess can we use things like COVID, where the failure of outsourcing, privatization, austerity, etc., have kind of like really like exploded, to say like, actually, if you want societies that are more resilient, more equitable, able to sort of respond to shared challenges better, we need a sort of different mix. But yeah, so there definitely are, but the challenge is scaling those rapidly and sort of fairly.
Okay. Yeah, thanks very much, Matt. Ailish, I see you have a question there about the donut model.
Yeah, Matt, I just wondered what your thoughts are on Kate Raworth's donut model. In other words, balancing the needs of people and planet, all people and planet, within the means of the planet, balancing the needs of everyone within the means of the planet. Because as I hear you speak, I see a lot of common ground between you and Kate Raworth's model.
Yeah, definitely. So Kate's model is really brilliant model, and we sort of use it actually as in the initial framing almost. She's got this line that if you look at the donut model, which sort of maintaining within sort of planetary boundaries, but then sort of making sure everyone's got a bare minimum in the sort of like in a donut on social provision and resourcing to live a good life. I mean, she makes the point that actually, if you look at sort of societies across the world, or countries across the world, no sort of societies are sort of properly developed economy or country, because those countries which have sort of high standards of living are completely shooting through planetary boundaries, and those countries which sort of are sort of living within planetary boundaries, so whether it's fossil fuel use, whether it's water use, etc., often are failing to provide sort of sustainable and decent quality of life for all. So we kind of use that as a springboard, as a sort of frame to say, like, that's definitely a sort of overarching architecture we need to sort of adapt and sort of work within the donut model, and then sort of try and begin to flesh it out. And the other thing I guess we sort of say, which links to her book, is sort of we need to think about this as sort of not just a project of the state, or not just a project of sort of decentralized production and cooperatives, etc., but actually think about working in tandem with sort of a democratized marketplace, a sort of more expansive and sort of democratized but also more powerful sort of state or public sector, a household economy where sort of gendered and racialized inequalities that kind of hardwired into it through unwaged labor and unwaged social reproduction are sort of challenged, and then obviously sort of expanded and sort of defended commons. So that's also another useful frame that she touches on, that we sort of build off the work of people like Ostrom and others on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, our president Michael D. Higgins over here has recently come out and endorsed the donut economics model as well in one of his.
I'd expect nothing less. He's a great guy.
Yeah, great argument for Republic.
Yeah, truly.
Now, Kevin, you did have more questions, and I think the one on the traditional actors on the left might kind of touch upon the point Matt was making about party politics. So do you want to ask this question?
Yeah, sure. I'm interested in how traditional actors on the left have sort of responded to your work and your ideas. And I mean, I'm particularly interested in the commons, but I mean, there's a whole range of ideas here about more democratic forms of economic organization, and so maybe you could say a little bit about where some might think traditionally it might be oriented towards public and state ownership. The value of democratization is sort of bringing different actors into, it's not only the state, but it's bringing different actors into the governance and different voices in there. If you could say a little bit more about that, yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, because I think that there is a sort of tension between, I guess, sort of, as you sort of allude to, sort of, right, well, we'll just, the solution will just be public ownership of, fossil fuels, or public ownership of, more resources, and the state will do it. And we definitely, absolutely think to deliver the type of social provisions, so like donut, sort of obviously minimum floor for everyone, and expand decommodification, make sure everyone has the resources they need to live a sort of secure and flourishing life. Things like public ownership of a whole host of areas, the provision of broadband, whatever it might be, are absolutely needed, because public ownership is a means by which you can plan, which you can coordinate, which you can center other values beyond profit. It's an incredibly useful tool that the very fact that it's returning after sort of sort of long permafrost to the historical stage through the return of a whole host of municipal and public ownership drives attests to. I think I think there's probably it's within the various tributaries of the left, and there's sort of a sort of, well, there might be more laborist, there might be more sort of like libertarian socialist traditions, etc., and there might be that fault line which then runs into commoning. I mean, I think I'll get it out in a moment and put it in the chat. We at Commonwealth, the organisation I run, we developed something called the Public Commons Partnership, which is, rather than sort of public-private partnership, it's sort of how do you take an asset which rather than just transfer into just straight public ownership, you say like, right, the public might anchor it, but it'll be managed in this democratic commons with a sort of commoners of whether it's workers, residents, whatever it might be. And that's interestingly been taken up by a whole host of areas. So we're working with a whole host of like in-place grassroots organizations in Liverpool, Newcastle, in North London, in Hastings on the south coast, in Plymouth in the sort of southwestish, who are looking to sort of take this idea and begin to grow this alternative. So it's not quite public ownership, but it's not sort of, it's definitely not privatization. So I think that, I think there's interest there, because I think, what they both share is, the fundamental, sort of commitment of the left, which is sort of, expanding freedom in ways that, the market and capitalism, preclude by design, and sort of, with equality. And so I think it is an interesting, sort of difference and fault line. And, I think you can see, and I don't know if you touched on it with Joe and Martin O'Neill, but like, there's a sort of fault line in some of the community wealth building movement of like, oh, is this just, is this just outsourcing by the back door, and shouldn't we just have, straight up public ownership? But I think there's a recognition that actually, like, pluralism with a purpose, not just pluralism for its own sake, but pluralism for a purpose, and institutional experimentation are quite important, and that, like, not least politically, because there needs to be a sense like, right, we've got some freshness. But I think also sort of the commons, I think, are important, because I think there are plenty of state-owned fossil fuel companies. So you can't just say, well, now it's in public ownership, that'll be enough. You need to think about the management, the sort of whose interests is it being held and prioritized here. And so things like commoning fossil fuel assets and sort of saying, this is a sort of resource that we have to manage, and we have to manage within environmental limits, rather than this is a resource to sort of, get money in the coffers. I think, that's where commoning, is kind of horses for courses. What are the sort of resources and institutions that are better suited to each? Work those out, build the coalitions to do that, deliver material benefits to people on the ground, and then sort of expand from there.
That's very interesting. We've here in Ireland, the industrialised peat extraction has recently been stopped. So there's kind of questions over the future, I suppose, for those communities who have been affected, in terms of whether there can be a just transition carried out. So we'll see how that develops. But it's interesting to think about it through the lens of commoning. I see, Ben, you have a question here, quite a practically focused one.
Yeah, it's probably an unfair question, really, but I decided to ask it anyway. I suppose where I'm coming from here is I do sometimes feel overwhelmingly pessimistic in the face of some of the facts that you've presented and that are presented elsewhere. I just watched, or almost finished watching, that David Attenborough documentary about the limits, the planetary limits, and it is quite depressing. So I was just looking for some sort of little nugget of optimism, that's something that we could actually do that would help.
Yeah, I think on the wider point, I think it's undeniably a sort of deeply it's a sort of systemic crisis, and that's deeply challenging. But I think the hopeful point is that and it is, the book, I think, is hopeful in the sense, like, our ultimate argument is like, this is a systemic crisis rooted in sort of institutions that humans have designed, and therefore we have the power to reimagine them. This is not beyond our capability. It's not like, well, it's just a meteor coming towards us that we can't do anything about. This is something that we can collectively, bend the curve. We can reimagine, and in the process, we can build societies that are much more equitable, much more sort of joyful, sustainable, and all the rest. So I think, this is a hopeful, if scary sort of project of collective reimagining. And that collective is definitely stressed. So, I think there are lots of things that individuals can do. But, this ultimately will require sort of collective transformation and social mobilization power to do that. That said, I've put in the chat two things quickly. So one is an article on 10 things you can do to sort of play your part. And the other is the paper on public commons partnership, if of interest. I think it depends on the context, but I think everything, and there are, while saying it's a systemic and sort of collective thing that we need to respond to, there are a whole host of things that individuals can and should be doing. So whether that's if they can, cycling and walking, etc., more taking sort of low carbon transport, whether it's, thinking carefully about sort of food choices and sort of very different impacts that, sort of certain meat production versus, other forms of, consumption could have, whether that's about sort of, joining a trade union at work and, being involved in sort of bargaining over sort of, industrial transition plans, whether that's about sort of joining campaign groups, whether it's local level or not, whether it's about sort of like, looking to develop, cooperative or community energy, renewable sort of production and generation distribution systems. There's a whole host of things that people can get involved in. And so we're not sort of like short of trying. I guess part of it, one of the things is like, not to despair, but then B, not to like burn out and sort of like sort of frenetic sort of response to despair, because there's a whole host of things, but we need to do this collectively. And so I guess it's partly spreading the message, I guess. Telling people to buy the book, how about that? No, like spread the message, and then like from that, like begin to cohere that sort of sense of social movement.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, and I can second that. It is actually an optimistic book, so it's and one that does kind of is a jolt of hope and inspiration as well. So it's definitely worth buying. And my good friend Dorothy has asked a question. It might overlap somewhat with Ben's, but Dorothy, did you want to come in and push Matt a bit further on something? She's still there?
I am, yeah, sorry, I was looking for my unmute. No, I guess, well, I like the idea of pushing the book there, Matt, yeah. Just to get, I mean, you've said it really there in that answer, joining co-ops, doing small things like that. I guess it is, as Ben said, slightly overwhelming and depressing, or it can be, and it's just like a big freight train coming towards us. It kind of feels like that. And it seems, I don't know. Well, you've really answered it though in that question. There was nothing in particular I was asking Patrick, no.
Okay, great.
No.
Well, it kind of triggered in my mind that there are like micro things we can do, like maybe cycle to work instead of drive to work. It does require sort of macro solutions to the type of cities we actually live in as well. It can't just be a case of picking up your bicycle if you feel that it's not a safe action to do. So it does, I mean, the micro and the macro, I guess, are always interlinked. But actually, I want to I guess we're coming towards the end. So if anyone has any like final burning questions, I'd recommend sticking it in the chat right now. But I want to actually ask Matt, because Matt was a guy who introduced me to the Lucas plan a long time ago. And that's something we've been discussing fairly regularly, actually, as part of the Organic Intellectuals. But you mentioned about this idea of, at the top of the hour, you were talking about redesigning, I suppose, the workplace. And you used this wonderful phrase in the book that the workplace is the private government of our lives. And I think the last year and a half has probably driven home how important where we work and how we work, and the changes that many of us experience. And in fact, for many people, how dangerous their workplace has become in like the recent crisis. I just wonder whether you can outline maybe some of the things that we could do to redesign our workplaces, or maybe some of the kind of the approaches that need to be taken. Yeah,
that's really. So one of the chapter on work like opens with a brief sketching of the Lucas plan, and like arguing those same instincts around sort of democratizing production, re-engineering, sort of technical systems to meet needs rather than produce bombs in that case, et cetera, is a sort of spirit and sort of level of ambition we need to excavate. And as you say, Patrick, sort of the way work, the inequality of work, and the workplace, and who's experienced risk, etc. in COVID only emphasizes that. I mean, I think there are again, the private government of the work can be challenged. We know how in some ways. At the moment, the workplace is governed by a nexus of, the executive, the board, which is elected by the legislature, which is only shareholders. So we can say, well, hold on, that's like ridiculous. Like that, like in no other legitimate government would you just be completely excluded from the government. So we can say like, right, workers on boards 50-50, shareholders, don't get to elect the board, or at the very least they have to sort of share the election of the board with other stakeholders. So that can begin to challenge that sort of private government. there are sort of, whether it's collective bargaining, whether it's sort of work councils, there are a whole series of institutions that, these are not, these work in many places in continental Europe, etc., etc., etc. Successfully, they can be extended, but sort of co-determination, new ways of sort of saying actually the tacit knowledge and ability of ordinary people is actually our greatest strength, and actually what we need to do is better cohere that, better provide spaces for that to be applied. And I think I think we also need to think about at the technical, also beyond the firm level, when it comes to technologies and work. In some sense, if we think of the sort of COVID vaccine, and this relates to investment, if we think of COVID vaccine, there have been many COVIDs and other sort of forms of fairly deadly diseases which have been inflicting misery and death on sort of many people, and particularly in the global south, for decades. But obviously, if you sort of leave medical investment broadly up to an oligopoly or big pharma, then they will tend to invest in the types of products that sort of maximize their profits rather than maximizes global public health. And so that that relates to work, in the sense if we want to develop technologies of work that liberate human potential, that allow for better forms of collective enjoyment, and sort of thinking through of how we can better organize work, we need to think about who controls investment. If we leave it in, if we leave investment about workplace technologies in the hands of Jeff Bezos, what we will see is very invasive surveillance techniques, automation that's done not to liberate human potential, but to sort of better sweat human labor, sort of very sort of extractive technological sort of development. So I think we have to sort of think about organizing in the workplace, organizing to change the sort of institutions that govern the workplace. So that's where corporate governance and things like that come in. And then thinking about sort of control of investment in the round, and how can we sort of use the example of this rapid development of the vaccine to say, well, can we think about developing technologies and techniques at work that actually reduce the amount of work, or at the very least reduce the drudgery we have to do, expand capability, sort of expand the ability for human potential to be fully realized at work and beyond it.
That goes right back to the Lucas workers designing socially valuable production rather than arms manufacturing, which sometimes those old ideas are the best, I think. We're a big fan of the Lucas plan anyway, the organic intellectuals. So we have you to thank for that, I think, for introducing us. Okay, I guess we've come to the top of the, we're past the top of the hour, so I guess we should be wrapping things up. So, because you're in the middle of a flat move as well, Ian, Matt. So I guess it's a quite a stressful time. So I'd like to thank Kevin for organising this whole kind of Zoom set and getting everything pulled together. I'd like to thank everyone for giving up their Saturday morning, particularly in the summer. It shows real commitment, and even though there is a touch of cloud, it's still a sacrifice. So thanks very much for coming along, and finally thanks to yourself, Matt, for for giving up your Saturday morning and sharing so many interesting ideas and policy solutions that we might want to take on board. And I'll just give it a final plug. The book is Planet on Fire from Verso Books, and I just had a look at the website there a few moments ago, and there is a 20% discount off it at the moment. So if you haven't got it, I would very much recommend taking a look at it.
It's also on Kindle, I just discovered, so I just downloaded it.
Oh, there we go. Perfect.
Well, thanks very much for having me, and thanks for all the excellent questions, etc. Pleasure to be with you all.